All right. Hello, everyone. This is Crew Howard again, Crew How. And today I'm going to share with you a talk about ChatGPT and AI and the end of learning as we know it. So I'll jump right into this. The summary is learning is often associated with learning information and knowing how to use it. But something has changed a lot with the internet that people are still adjusting to. Even though you're younger and you've known it your whole life, I think things are really changing now. Information first with the internet in 2000 and now with ChatGPT and AI, all knowledge is easily searchable. In other words, if you have a routine question, knowledge, you can always get a reasonable answer from a computer. And now with AI, you can also ask follow-up questions in a natural way to dive even deeper. So although I could teach you a lot of information in this class about thinking skills, I'm not going to because I'm not going to teach you anything that AI can answer just as well, and I'm going to demonstrate this. And at the end of this talk, I'll talk to you about 3 limitations of AI that hopefully you'll notice by watching this video. So first, let me just jump into a demonstration of AI and thinking skills and logical fallacies. I'm going to use Gemini rather than ChatGPT. Gemini is from Google. So here is Gemini. I'm going to start a new chat, gemini.google.com, and you can do this on your own. So I'm going to first type, what are thinking skills? Thinking skills. And it's going to bloop, 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 and tell me exactly a pretty good definition of what thinking skills are. And AI does a really good job because it searches all sorts of information and collates it in a way. So a lot of people define it differently. I think Google and Gemini does a good job of presenting you a pretty complete list. So thinking skills are mental abilities that help us process information, solve problems, and make decisions effectively. It has to do with critical thinking. It has to do with problem solving. It has to do with creativity, generating decision-making, memory, attention, and reasoning, blah, blah, blah. So you can also translate the last answer to Thai. And it can generate you the answer in Thai in a pretty, I can't read Thai. So it can also actually read it to you too.
ภาษาไทยทักษะการคิดคือความ
Okay, so I'm not going to do that. You can just go to Gemini, type in the exact same thing, or ask the question in Thai, and you'll get the answer in Thai. So diving a little deeper, you can ask the Gemini AI, is pattern recognition an important thinking skill? And have it give you an answer. Yes, pattern recognition is a crucial thinking skill. Oh, okay, it's saying it's crucial. It's the ability to identify and understand recurring patterns, structures, or rules within information. And it's related to these things. There's a list there, you can read it. And then I'll write again, translate to Thai, the last answer. In fact, that happens so much, I'm just gonna copy that. So I can do that. Okay. So it's translated that to Thai. And if I want to dive in any deeper, tell me more about evaluating evidence. And it tells me, oh, what are the things of evaluating evidence? Evaluating evidence is a crucial skill, etc., etc. You can read this on your own. When evaluating evidence, ask yourself these questions: reliability, credibility, relevance, bias, sufficiency, and then common types of evidence: anecdotal evidence, empirical evidence, etc., techniques for evaluating it, etc. So you can have this information. Oh, now we know what is evaluating evidence. What are the features of evaluating evidence? Where that is a critical thinking skill, a crucial thinking skill. So going back to, let's see. Okay, so going back, I wanted to translate to Thai. So there you have the Thai translation of this. And if you want to read it, you can either pause the video and read it in the video, or you can generate this yourself using Gemini. So now going back to this, I want to share with you what the Thinking Skills class did last year. In one of their 3-hour classes, because the teacher wasn't able to go every week or every few weeks, they just had a few long multi-hour sessions. So in that last year for Thinking Skills class, which I watched, each student was given a bias from a list of 20 biases. And they were asked to research it and give a 2 to 5 minute presentation on the bias. I watched these. Every student did a good job. I noticed some students spent a lot of time making the presentation look good and professional, using animations and transitions. Others simply gave a definition and then showed a YouTube video and talked about it. According to some people, the reviews from the students were very high. I don't read Thai and I didn't see the reviews myself. But I could see the students liked it. They felt proud of what they did, and they found it to be useful when asked about, especially about the one they presented. But I'm not doing that this year. And I'm going to show you why using ChatGPT/Gemini AI, so that you can see that nowadays you can do that very easily with just a computer, any computer with internet access. So I'm going to ask, maybe you've heard of this thing called confirmation bias. If you haven't, then it'll become apparent in the question. So I'm going to ask the question, is confirmation bias important to recognize when developing thinking skills? And so again, say, yes, confirmation bias is crucial to recognizing and when developing thinking skills. It defines what confirmation bias is, and it tells you why it's important. So it prevents objective analysis, it hinders decision making, it promotes polarization. So to overcome this, you should do these 4 things. And again, I'll just copy paste, translate the last answer to Thai. And it does a reasonable job. Whoops, sorry, I got a mosquito in the room. It does a reasonable job of translating this to Thai, I assume. Of course, Google Translate is not perfect. I think the AI Translate is actually quite a lot better. So it's up, since you know both languages, you know Thai more importantly, you can do the side-by-side comparison between Google Translate and AI Translate. There we have confirmation bias, which is one of the biases. But suppose the teacher was like, one of the goals of a thinking skills class is for you to be able to identify 20 thinking skills, define them, and give an example. So let's see if Gemini can do that. So I'm going to write, my teacher wants a list of 20 biases for thinking skills. Please list 20. And it will just list those out. Now, if you went to a Google search, you could also find many of these same lists of biases, as well as many more than just 20. And in a future video, I will show you a link to several places where you can look and find a lot more biases and a lot more information about it. For now, I'll just translate to Thai, and you can see a long list of these biases. Okay, so next, groupthink is listed on here. I think groupthink is here. Let's see. Actually, groupthink is not on here, but it was on an earlier list. So I'll just write, what is groupthink? And is it a fallacy? So you can see what it is. So it will just give you an answer. And groupthink is when a group of people reach a consensus without critically evaluating it and leading to poor choices. It's a form of cognitive bias leading to poor decision making. And here are reasons why it can happen. It's related to some of the up above. it did list things like bandwagon fallacy and a few other things. So groupthink is one of the things that I wanted to talk about. So next, I might ask, give me, first translate to Thai, so you can have it. Just take a second. And there's the Thai. It will take you some moments to read it if you want to. You can pause the video and read it, or you can generate this yourself. Okay, so then the next thing is to ask, give me an example of groupthink. So it will give me an example of groupthink. Okay, and it gives me a famous example. 1961, the United States and the Cuban government and it as a groupthink. But maybe that's not what I want. I actually won't translate this answer to Thai because maybe I want to give me an example of groupthink related to school and high school students applying for college. That's what you're currently doing, probably. Imagine a high school with a strong emphasis on Ivy League universities. The top students at the school may feel immense pressure to apply to these prestigious institutions, even if they're not the best fit for their academic and personal goals. The pressure can lead to groupthink among the students as they may, so these are ways that groupthink can apply, conform to expectations, or they may self-censor themselves. So they may not be they may hesitate to express doubts and about applying to Ivy League schools. Or if Ivy League is not what applies in Thailand, then the top schools of Thailand. I think there's a name for them, but I actually forget that name. Or there's an illusion of unanimity where you think everyone wants the same thing, so you can't really talk about it because if everyone wants the same thing, you don't want to not fit in. Or rationalization or other things like that. So this gives you an example. If you wanted follow-up questions, you could definitely do that. And I'll just hit the translate to Thai so you have it in Thai if you want it. Okay. So what I've shown you with this demo number 2, where I go to Gemini and ask about cognitive biases and logical fallacies, this demo number 2, and also for examples, is Google can totally do this. Google can absolutely do this. So what is the value of information now? With Google, Gemini, and AI, ChatGPT, things like this, anybody with a phone computer can now access the definition of any cognitive bias and generate examples of that cognitive bias, even related to specific contexts where Google might not have a good example in a searching web pages of already generated content. So it's then tempting, and it actually, I would say, unfortunately common to then conclude that one knows the cognitive bias. So going back to last year, the students, they look up these things, they put a lot of effort in. I'm not saying it was easy either. These things, can be tricky, but they go and they maybe looked at a few websites. They probably spent somewhere between 1 hour and 5 hours. They presented it, they generated the slides, maybe it was another 2 or 3 hours. They put in maybe up to 8 hours of work is my estimate. So then they really know it, right? They put in 8 hours of work, they really know it. Maybe not. It's tempting to conclude that you know cognitive bias, but in a way you do, but can you use the information? So if I asked you, how does this apply to your life? How does this fallacy compare to that fallacy? Can you answer those types of questions? And I think whether a student spends 1 hour or 8 hours, or even just 5 minutes typing into Gemini and asking, like here, give me an example of groupthink related to high school and high school students applying to college, and just 5 minutes to generate it and read it. Oh, that makes sense. Or you actually go through the work of doing it yourself very quickly, maybe 1 hour, like the M6 students last year. Or you spend 8 hours really tweaking it, really looking and digging into it, getting something interesting and thinking about it carefully. Which of these is really knowing it? And I would say none of these is actually fully knowing it because going back, can you use the information? Scarily enough, AI can now do that for you. So I'm going to use Gemini to do some pretty complicated thinking. So let's say your teacher asks you, let's see, is groupthink related to emotional reasoning? Because Crew How and other teachers have learned that when you can make connections and compare and contrast, this is much higher in your ability to use information. Lower information students can only repeat information or apply in a sort of brainless fashion. But if you can compare and contrast, that means you really know what something is. So is groupthink related to emotional reasoning? That's a very interesting question. Now Google can now give you the answer to that question. Yes, groupthink can be related to emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is the tendency to make decisions based on emotions rather than logic or reason. In groupthink, the desire to maintain harmony within the group can override rational thought and lead to decisions that are influenced more by emotion than by evidence. So groupthink is often ignoring evidence or not using certain evidence or not bringing up evidence, and emotions can be part of that. And it gives you some very clear examples. And if I want to, I'm going to first translate to Thai so you can see it in case you need the Thai. Okay, and I can ask it, can you give me more information about the link between the two? And let's see, I actually haven't tried this. Okay, and it gives you even more. It gives you a lot more, actually. And I'm not going to translate to Thai because it's a little long, but you could translate this to Thai yourself. Next, you might be, I'll conclude that groupthink and emotional reasoning often reinforce each other. So they are very related. So that might be what someone who jumps to conclusions might conclude. But hey, Google Gemini is very helpful. I can ask a similar question and ask, is groupthink different from emotional reasoning? Okay. So before I asked, is groupthink related to emotional reasoning? Now it's say, are they different? Oh, groupthink and emotional reason are related, but they're not identical. And it gives you some things here. And I can ask, give me an example. And it can spit you out an example. Actually, this is an example of emotional reasoning with groupthink, and how they can interact with each other. That's not exactly what I want, but I might ask, can you give me an example of groupthink without emotional reasoning? And it can give you that. Okay, I'll go ahead and translate that to Thai, so in case you need to. I'm going through this quickly because you can pause the video and read any of these things. It's more I want you to see what it is, that it can do these. And these answers, I've looked through this already. These answers are actually quite good. If anyone answered these on an SAT, like essay, they would get probably full points for any of these. Because they're well organized, they make sense, and they use the information in the way asked. So lastly, I just asked about groupthink without emotional reasoning. Now I'm going to ask, can you give me an example of emotional reasoning without groupthink? And it will give you an answer of emotional reasoning without groupthink. And there you have it. So, someone who's making a personal decision about high salary and the benefits of one job and personal satisfaction from another job. And because it's only themselves, there's no groupthink involved, according to this example. Because it's a personal decision driven by emotional factors, but not from a group. And I really want to say something. This is the thing I want to say. I don't actually think this is a good answer, but I don't think it's a terrible answer. And part of really understanding these topics is looking at these like subtle gray areas of how is this um, emotional, how could groupthink be in here? So part of really knowing these things is looking at these like not obvious things. It's not everything is obvious and clear cut. But I show this later with a clearer example with actual questions. So I don't want to dive into it. I'll translate that to Thai while I look at my notes. Okay. And then finally, I'm going to sort of a thing called dog fooding, which means I'm going to eat my own medicine. Meaning, I keep on telling you that stories are related to all thinking skills. So I'm going to write, my teacher told me that thinking skills are related to the stories we tell ourselves. Is this correct? Okay. And it says, yes, your teacher is correct. The stories we tell ourselves often referred to as our internal narrative, which is a much fancier way of saying the reasoning we have, can significantly influence our thinking skills. These stories shape our beliefs, attitudes, and perspectives, etc., etc. And it gives you details about this. So you might think my emphasis on talking about stories is simplistic, but it's actually quite related to these things. It's just a presentation that I think is a simpler way to approach this than to use technical words or jargon. But maybe you like the technical words and jargon. So internal narrative, if you like that better, that's what you should focus on. But the stories are a big part of thinking skills, in my opinion. So going back to the slides, Gemini can do these compare and contrast. It can connect different ideas. It can actually give answers that are sophisticated and suggest that you really know what's going on. And even if you cannot think of these answers on your own, which I think is fair. It's not a deficiency if you can't think of these things on your own. But if you ask enough of these questions, if you can notice the pattern of how Gemini is answering these questions, or if you can simply follow along, you can read it and it makes sense to you. And that maybe you ask a follow-up question and you can make a guess as to this follow-up, the answer. So how are stories related to groupthink? That might be something you're like, I think I know the answer to this question. How are stories related to groupthink? But let me check Google Gemini. I think stories are related because we're thinking about what other people will think about, and do we want to be the same as them? Do they have, maybe they have more information than I do. Maybe I shouldn't really go with what my gut says or what I feel inside. Maybe I should think about what they say because they've thought about it a lot, etc. So let me double check. Is that a good thing? Stories can play a significant role in groupthink. The narratives we share and internalize can shape our beliefs, attitudes, and perspectives. There's things just doing the highlighted elements. Shared identity can be an issue, a justification of our actions, a reinforcement of our beliefs. We might think carefully if we were on our own, but if 10 of our friends all think the same thing, we might be like, oh, I don't have to think carefully. But 10 of our friends doesn't really prove anything. Or we might be looking for the emotional connection. In all these ways, it can drive groupthink. So yeah, maybe you can use Gemini to help you work through your thinking. And it's actually extremely powerful. And I think Gemini is something, and ChatGPT is something, only in the last year has it had these types of powers and strengths. So going back to the main topic, is ChatGPT and AI, is this the end of learning as we know it? I think it is in a lot of ways. So is this learning? Let's look at what the first three demos have said. If a student can give a definition, number one, give a definition. Number two, give examples. Number three, compare and contrast and draw links between different topics. Does they mean they learned thinking skills? And if you don't really know for sure, and if you use Gemini and it spits out an answer and you actually can follow along with the answer and you can internalize it and work with it and be like, yeah, I can see how that works. I can see how that works. And maybe even on a test, maybe you aren't allowed to ask Gemini while you're doing the test, but you can ask Gemini as much as you want before the test, and you ask it a lot of questions and you really think about it. And then you're given a bunch of test questions about comparing, contrasting. And let's say you are able to have infinite time and able to look at all your notes. Then typing in a lot of questions and thinking it through, you can really answer almost any compare and contrast question about these things, or at least show that you have knowledge of some of the approaches, show evidence that you've learned things, show evidence that you have things in your mind that you can use and manipulate. So I would say that 90% of people would say yes, that this is the evidence that you learn thinking skills. Okay, this over here. And certainly this is more than enough to pass any written test that anyone would ask you. But this is Buddhism, and Crew Howard, would say no. This is not what learning thinking skills is. I mean, it's part of the process. I think you need to use a lot of these things, but it's not thinking skills. It doesn't mean you've learned it to the level that I would like you to learn it. And I'm not actually saying my level is higher. I actually will tell you my level is actually lower. It's lower, and I'll show you kind of why. So 90% of people stop at these types of questions, compare and contrast, etc. But I think what matters more with thinking skills for me is noticing things that are hard to see. And I'm going to ask ChatGPT Gemini some questions to demonstrate what these questions are. So Gemini will actually give you great answers to this. But the critical skill here is to know that you need to ask these questions, or know that these questions are askable and maybe important. So this goes back to blind spots. If you don't know there's a blind spot in your eye, you can't look for it. And if you don't know that as you're driving a car, your mirrors actually can't see certain parts of the road, you're not going to turn your head. That's why students need to be told, hey, there's things you don't see, you need to be careful about them. Once they turn their head, it's obvious. But until they turn their head, they can't see it. And similarly, with the gorilla example, with the basketballs, if you don't know that, go watch the video that I linked to in the line group about selective attention. If you're counting the balls that the basketball players in white are passing the ball, you completely ignore the black shirted people, including a gorilla that just walks straight through the video and waves their arms around. All right. So to really understand the power of thinking skills, you need to ask some of these questions. And I'll go back to Gemini and offer you what some of those questions are. Now, it's not the answer to these questions, which is the important part. The thing is, you need to know to ask these questions, and then furthermore, know how to apply them. I think this will become obvious once I start asking these questions. So why don't I go ahead and do that? So the first question I want to ask is, in thinking skills, what are some things easy to say, but hard to do? Okay. This is a phrase in Thai. I'm going to not say it very well, but Put ngai tam yak, right? Easy to say, but hard to do. De tam yak. Okay. So in thinking skills, what are some things easy to say but hard to do? And it gives you exactly that. It's easy to say, think critically, but applying critical thinking involves evaluating information objectively, considering multiple perspectives, avoiding biases. And these are not always easy to do. It's simple to say, solve the problem, but effectively identifying the root cause, developing innovative solutions, and implementing them can be difficult, this problem-solving one. Or similarly with creativity, decision-making, empathy, and self-awareness. It's easy to say and very popular if you're at all on Instagram. It's like, you need to be self-aware. You need to know yourself. You need to really know yourself, which is encouraging people to focus a lot about themselves and knowing what they like and what they don't like, and what's easy for them, what's difficult for them. But self-awareness, it's easy to say know yourself, but gaining a deep understanding of your own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors can be a challenging journey in self-reflection, etc., etc. And just because this is, I think, important, I'll translate it to Thai. Again, you can pause the video and read through this, which I think is a very good list. And you don't need to agree with all 7 of these. If you just find 1 or 2 of these that actually speaks to you, yeah, that is hard to do. Or I have a very good example in my life where this was hard for me to do, then that you've won. That is thinking skills. Noticing that it's hard to do, noticing that if you just memorize self-awareness and you say, oh, yeah, someone who doesn't realize that they're angry because they have a bias about people with large dogs. Maybe someone doesn't like people with large dogs that bark. Then, oh, well, if you're aware of that bias, then you can do okay. But then you might completely be not aware of other biases. So you need to be careful about these things. What are some things that are easy to say but hard to do? And a follow-up question, just to dive a little deeper and relating to the college, you're applying the college, I'm going to ask, what is self-awareness of fear, right? So there's a lot of fear about uncertainty and about your future. So this is, what is self-awareness? How do you apply it to fear? So self-awareness of fear is ability to recognize your own feelings of fear, to identify the physical sensations, thoughts, and emotions associated with that fear, as well as understanding the underlying causes and triggers. Now, I don't have a very good way to introduce fear in the classroom to you, so that's why I use that feather. That feather is telling you to identify the physical sensations, and then the phrase that a lot of students picked up was, my mind is big, my mind is big, allowing you to really notice what's happening. And maybe control your breathing, control your thoughts, notice all the chemicals that are raging through. This is what is important. This is the self-awareness element. So giving you something where you can actually experience a way of being self-aware was my goal there. I don't know how many of you actually made that connection this time, but maybe you'll make it later. Maybe me mentioning it now will help make that connection. But around self-awareness of fear, there are some of these things. And so going back to, this is more actually like compare and contrast. So you're applying self-awareness of fear to these things. So another follow-up question, let me translate to Thai while I look at my notes, is it easy to trick ourselves into believing we have self-awareness of our fears? So this isn't something a person would normally ask if they're asked to learn about thinking skills. It'd be foolish to ask someone, hey, you just learned some algebra, some math. Is it easy to trick yourself into believing you've learned math? I mean, in some ways it is. Like if you just read the book and you don't actually do any problems, then you might fool yourself into thinking you understand it. but most of you are actually quite, you understand test taking and going to college. So you got to take sample questions. You got to ask yourself questions. And if you can't answer those questions, then you've tricked yourselves into believing it. But with self-awareness of our fears, there's no like objective test. There's no like x squared plus 2x plus 2 kind of question. So it is easy to trick ourselves. And it's not easy to have a test that says, am I tricking myself? But this actually gives you a pretty reasonable list of things. So let me translate to Thai, but look at this. Yes, it's easy to trick ourselves into believing we have self-awareness of our fears. Our minds can be very good at rationalizing and justifying our actions and emotions, even when they're driven by fear. We might convince ourselves that we are acting out of logic or reason, when in reality, fear is influencing our decisions. So this is maybe not realizing we have fear. I generally realize our fear, but fear doesn't apply in this situation. Or we might trick ourselves into thinking, oh, we have fear, but we really understand that fear without really understanding it. But again, here there's denial, there's rationalization, there's projection, there's distraction. These are all things we can do when we have fears, and we might be doing them for a good reason, for some results, but we're doing them. And if we have self-awareness, we need to really check. And one way to check around fears is to ask ourselves, hey, what are some easy ways to trick ourselves into thinking that we know this, right? Because it's very easy to be like, oh, I understand these biases. I am understanding emotional reasoning. Let me double check. Am I using emotional reasoning? Am I applying fear here? And be like, no, I'm not applying fear. This is a very logical, good reasoning. But I think a clearer thing might be to ask, am I denying? Am I too strong in my denial that there's fear? Am I rationalizing something that's fear-driven? Is there a reasonable reason why I shouldn't rationalize this conclusion that might be driven by fear? Or am I projecting my fear onto others, blaming them for our own anxieties? When really I'm feeling the fear, am I using blame? I think these are clearer questions, and they're kind of nudging, hey, that might be fear going on. So again, here's the Thai answer, so you can look through that. And I think in a previous example, it asked me, I have a lot of mosquitoes in here, so sorry about my constant fly swatting. Can you give me some techniques to recognize I'm tricking myself? And it will give you some techniques. And actually, this is not exactly what I want. I came tricking myself. Can you give me some techniques? I am tricking myself with myself that to check. Sorry, this is better. To check if I am tricking myself that I am self-aware of fear. So techniques, if you're truly self-aware of your fears, maybe this actually did talk about fears. No, that was just talking about general things about fear. And then it gives you some good mindfulness and self-observation, definitely things that the Buddha has taught, and a lot of Thai people have tried in some form, although often not in the form as the Buddha has taught it. And meditation teachers really encourage people to learn it. Anyways, separate topic. Seek external feedback, because they might be able to see things you don't see. Challenge your assumptions. Be open to discomfort. So these are things that you can do to help yourself explore whether you're actually self-aware of fear, or avoidance. Resist the urge to avoid situations that trigger fear. So this gets back to something in cognitive behavioral therapy where you actually expose yourself to small versions of the fear so you can get comfortable around it. And then you don't have the chemicals raging as much that are influencing your decisions. Again, chemicals last for, anywhere from like a minute to 90 minutes, unless you have stories to keep repeating the thing that triggers the fear. And then your fear can last your whole life if you wanted to. If you continue to have those triggers and having those thought patterns. So those are some techniques, and you want to develop these techniques. Now, reading the techniques does not mean you've developed it. You actually have to, I think, struggle. Maybe not all of these apply to you, but I think at least one of these applies to you. And you want to struggle in an interesting way where you actually learn something about yourself. You learn about how you think and see some way where you think differently. But to continue in on this journey of like questions you might ask to really see if you understand these thinking skills in a deep way is this other question. Is it ever not useful? So a lot of people say, oh, self-awareness is always useful. It's always useful. But I think if you look at psychology, and I've done some crisis counseling, so is it ever not useful to develop self-awareness of fear? What are some disadvantages? And then this I'll translate to Thai. I can't read Thai, so I'm not going to focus on that right now. Self-awareness of fear is generally beneficial. There are a few disadvantages. You can overwhelm yourself if you try to be too self-aware of that fear. So sometimes it might be too much. Avoidance, a deep understanding of your fears may lead to avoidance behaviors. It might make it easier to justify avoiding situations that trigger them. This is in contrast to another technique, which is to actually confront your fears in small doses where you're not overwhelmed so you can get to understand the fear. And also overanalysis, paralysis by analysis. Overanalysis can lead to indecision or anxiety, generating more fear possibly, which is not what they wrote, but what I'm adding. So it's important to balance the self-awareness and action and what's actually helpful or valuable to you. And here's the Thai, so you can read through it. So I think if you're going to look at fear, you can't just look at like, oh, well, I'm going to look at what are some biases, what are a few things to do with fear. There are tricky parts to it. Like sometimes you don't want to use self-awareness. When are those times? And if you actually learn to look at your own body in a Buddhist context or look at your own body and mind from a Western psychological context, you can start noticing and getting a sensitivity to, hey, when is self-awareness helpful? When is it not awareness? And then here's another interesting question. How can I tell the difference between being in denial of fear versus just having healthy fears? Okay. And I'll also translate the last answer to Thai. Oops. I stopped that response. So, whoops. Let me hit. I'm not I cannot type a question while it's generating the answer to a question. Okay, and translate that to Thai. So how can I tell the difference, going back here, how can I tell the difference between being in denial of fear versus just having healthy fears? So it's normal to experience fear. Denying its presence or minimizing its impact can be detrimental. So it gives you some healthy ways of approaching the fear, and then gives you some unhealthy ways that are denials of fear, and it gives you some signs to look at it. So you might look into this. But even here, there are subtle things. If you really go into Buddhism or even psychology, you'll have, like, if you're thinking about becoming a psychologist and working with clients, there are tricky things. Like, people might say, oh yeah, I've acknowledged and accepted my fears, but there might be ways that they're not actually even able to see it. It's a blind spot. They're like, oh yeah, I know I'm afraid. First, they'd like to not be afraid, but then maybe they've gone to a therapist and they say, oh, maybe you're afraid. And they're like, oh yeah, I looked into it. Yeah, maybe I'm afraid, but I think it's a healthy fear. But how do they really know? And can someone from the outside even see these things? I think these are very interesting questions that you can go into. I'm not saying you need to know everything about this, but thinking skills is very much about these gray areas where you want to start looking more carefully rather than just like self-awareness of fear. Acknowledge and accept. That's a healthy fear. Look, I acknowledge and accept it. I have a healthy fear. Go away. I've learned this. No, it's you want to check many things, and then you want to actually see, is this correct in my situation, especially in a personal situation, like your own fears. How does that work for you? And here, this is translated Thai. Again, you can pause and read this, or you can generate it on your own. There's nothing special or unique about my version of Google versus your version of Google. So these are all ways to delve deeper into this question of right, is just being able to compare and contrast thinking skills. No, you actually have to. I would say 90% of people don't ask the questions I just asked. But I believe that to really understand the power of thinking skills, you want to think about these not obvious situations, these tricky situations where, you can read the textbook example, but then how does it actually apply to your life? So my goal, or our goal for this thinking skills class, this is probably unlike any class you've taken, which is those classes are mostly about memorization or specific skill development. In those classes, there's a clear model of this is correct behavior, this is not correct behavior, and if you copy the behavior or find the right answer, you succeed. And in fact, you need to copy and find the right answer for like 100 different things, and then you've succeeded. In this class, it's really about thinking and thinking about thinking differently. And if you find just one thing where you can say, now I can see a choice or pattern of thinking that I couldn't see this before. This is important to me because, and you give your reason. Having that meaningful reason of having your way of thinking change from something I've said, this class is a success. I'll go even further. If I teach you 100 things, and really I'm just giving you things to try out that I think might interest you. That's why when I come into class, it's not like, oh, I have this and this and this, memorize this, repeat this back to me. It's giving you lots of different ways to look at it. And if one thing really resonated with you and you can dig, and it's important to you for a reason, even if I show you 100 things and there's only one important thing that's important, 99 are not important to you, but you remember that one thing and it applies to you 5 years later in your life, that is success. That is success around this question of thinking skills. That's my goal, and I think that's our goal, because that's our goal. Now, if you like, I would say this is unique to my perspective of Buddhism and my own perspective of what students need to be high-level thinkers and do jobs that are hard and not straightforward. But let me just go back and say that last demo where you asked these tricky gray areas, that's not really what most of the world cares about. I'm sorry to say that. Most people don't value thinking skills. The Buddha definitely valued thinking skills. Everything he taught about was about your mind being the thing where everything goes through, and how your mind is not just a passive observer. It's a shaper of how you experience things. And if you can really see a way where your mind is shaping how you experience things, that's the vital thing. And then the rest of your life can be really looking more closely at that. Because the first time you see something that you couldn't see before, that's the hardest. And then after that, it's just applying that same formula, but to different things in your life. Sometimes this is called 0 to 1 is the hardest. The first piece of software to write is the hardest. Then the rest, you just make copies of it. It's pretty straightforward. But for 90% of people in the world, they don't even think that far. If you just give it a definition, self-awareness of fear. Here are some examples of self-awareness of fear. Is self-awareness of fear the same as denial? Is denial applicable? Can you apply it to some other things? Just very straightforward, like what is this? What is the relationship between A and B? But not really delving into these tricky things that are hard to see. They'll be quite happy with it. So again, it's up to you. I'm telling you from my personal experience, from Buddhism, from my personal experience in my own life, from my personal experience working with students, and noticing the differences between students who can really think and students who can't think, noticing the difference between students who have emotional balance and who don't. These are important skills to develop. So if you can have just one thing where now I see this choice or pattern of thinking, I couldn't see this before. This is important to me because I want to make a lot of money and this will help me in making a lot of money. Or because I have a lot of problems with my family and I want to be able to live with my family better. Or I have a lot of uncertainty and I often make myself miserable with my fears. I can see this more clearly. Or I didn't think I had a problem with addiction to certain distractions or something, but now I see like addiction and distraction are part of a thinking pattern that can be related to fear, etc. All of these things, if you just find that one thing, it's extremely valuable. With that one thing, you can explore any topic of thinking skills you want, often with the help of books for old people like me who like to look at books, or for AI for modern young adults. You have to ask good questions and not just the obvious questions. If you only look at the obvious questions, you can look very smart. You can repeat your answers to a lot of smart people and they will feel very good. And 90% of the cases will probably be very obvious. But the most important and hardest to see things, where you'll be most valuable, are where it's hard for people to see things. And this is where thinking skills helps you see things that are hard to see. It's one of the most beautiful things to teach, things that are hard to see, and also the most frustrating because you can't see that. I can't just say, do you see this? Because the moment I point it out, it becomes obvious, right? It's like the gorilla in that video. Once you point it out, it's obvious. But when you don't see it, realizing that you might not see it when you don't see it, and then developing routines and ways so that you don't get caught off guard by these things. This is kind of the beauty of thinking skills. From a Buddhist context, or from an academic success context, or from just a personal psychological life context. And finally, noticing in obvious situations is easy. The hard and very useful part is when you can see something that is not so obvious and not so easy to see. As I demonstrated in the demo, these are asking the follow-up questions that most people wouldn't. But if you spend time looking at your fears, it becomes very apparent there's things going on that you didn't realize, but once someone points it out and it might take, a few days, or in the case of Buddhism or therapy, it might take years to really come to grips of things. But when you see it, it becomes something that changes you, usually for the better, because you notice something that was making you miserable. In Buddhism, it was creating dukkha. Or in psychology, in therapy, it would be creating your own misery or creating emotional imbalance. So what a thinking class should do, this is my opinion. If you ask most people, even if you ask some people at PPS, they might say, oh, thinking skills should teach you XYZ, learn these 20 biases, give me examples, apply it to your life, ... I'm not interested in that because I think I don't want to instruct you on what a thinking skill is, like the definition, give me an example. That information in the age of AI search, it's easily accessible to anyone who wants to learn it. And if you want to learn it, you'll have the motivation to look it up if you want to and go into it. And you can ask me any question you want about these. I'm happy to go into these, but I'm really more focused on generating motivation about thinking skills. And hopefully this chat with AI, it's showing you both a scary future where all information is there and computers can think and do things often better than I can, or at least as good as I can in a lot of ways. So it's more about what I want to do with this video is generating motivation that what are the thinking skills? What are the questions you want to ask? Why is it important to ask those follow-up questions? This class is about rousing interest. Rousing means to create, to have it arise, to make, to birth interest in your own heart, to see how these skills are important today or can be important in your future life. Thinking skills are especially important for blind spots you might have about your own patterns of thinking. It should not be another thing to learn, meaning memorize, and then be able to repeat back on an exam or to a teacher when they ask you a question. You have to be able to use it. And hopefully, I don't know which of you this applies to, but it applies to some of you. I think you might be approaching a lot of this class as, what's the information? How do I use it? What do you want me to know? And how can this apply to my life? I can give you examples, but you have to take the final step to say, this is important to my life. And maybe 99 things I say are not important to you. Your job is to find the one thing that I say that you think is important to you, or how you can apply it. If you find that just that one thing, I think it's going to be to your great benefit. And I think I would call this thinking skills class a success if you're able to do that. And hopefully, it's my very sincere hope that you are able to do that, to use this information to expand your thinking about how you think and how your thinking drives a lot of your life. So summary, this first part is the same. Learning is often associated with learning information and knowing how to use it. So I've shown you some examples where ChatGPT and AI, now all knowledge is easily searchable. So if you just want facts, factual information, AI is going to outdo every single human already. But in other words, if you have routine knowledge questions, you can always get a reasonable answer from a computer. And the answer will give you a starting point. And now with AI, you can even ask follow-up questions. So once you get that starting point, you can ask even more questions. But which questions you ask is what matters. So I'm not going to teach you the answer to any questions that AI can answer just as well. Just use AI. Right? AI is actually probably gives you a more complete answer. It gives you a more organized answer, and you can translate it to Thai, etc. Very easily. And you can call it at 3 a.m. on your phone at any time. And you don't have to memorize it. You can just look it up. Versus what I teach you, you either have to memorize it or remember, oh, where did he say it? And look it up. No, AI can do this. So you don't have to memorize anything for this thinking skills class. Right? It's a very different class. But how to use AI and this learning, so let me put some, learning is associated with learning information. This is now dead, meaning I say dead because anyone with a computer can now learn the information and tell you the right answer. But knowing how to use it is the special part, right? I think dead is a ordinary, I think is tamada, I think in Thai. So the special thing, the unique thing that will set you apart from other people is is knowing how to use it. That's what's special. So as you have AI, here's 3 limitations of AI that I think I've demonstrated in this presentation. ChatGPT and Gemini AI doesn't tell you how to use the information. Knowing information is now a 0% differentiator, but knowing how to use it is what matters most. And ChatGPT doesn't tell you how do I use it. Although you can ask ChatGPT, how do I use it? And it will tell you how it thinks you should use it. And if you follow along to that, you can say, I know how to use it. But you know how to use it in the one case ChatGPT gave you. And it might not be applicable in that situation. So it has all the knowledge in the world, but doesn't know exactly what the right thing to apply is. It doesn't know your situation. So the second thing I've written here, ChatGPT doesn't tell you what good questions to ask for your situation are. This especially applies to blind spots. So around thinking skills, on a basic level, you can ask, I'm struggling with fear. What are some things I could do? And it will spit you out some things you can do. And then you might ask, what are some disadvantages? What are some advantages? What might I be missing if I apply this? What are some of the risks of overdoing it? What are some of the risks of underdoing it? How can I tell I'm actually doing it? These are questions you can ask, and it will give you some very good suggestions, but they're ultimately suggestions. And this is where the actual experience of applying information to looking at how you think, that's a very, in a way, that's a very personal thing, because no one can look at your mind and tell you, oh, your thinking skills are really good. You can spit out, you can say things, and they can, by what you say, it can make it obvious that you don't know what you're talking about. But if you say all the right things, that's still not a guarantee that you actually do know what you're talking about. And so in Buddhism, it's quite funny because there are monks who talk about other monks, and they'll say, oh, that monk has a lot of broad knowledge, knows a lot of things, has studied a lot of things, but his knowledge is very shallow. And what they mean by that is like, oh, the monk can repeat all of these things, and you can ask it questions and can tell you the right answers, but he can't put it into practice. He doesn't talk about it as if he's actually experienced it and knows how to use it. So ChatGPT can give incorrect or conflicting information. Usually it's not incorrect. Usually it doesn't quite apply here, or it might apply, etc. So this sorting and weighing information to make decisions, noticing what are some things it might be missing, is something that really requires human judgment, especially for thinking skills. You need to be like, hey, did this work? What do I notice in my body? What do I notice in the chemicals in my body? What do I notice in the stories of my mind? So if you can notice those things and you notice something, but it isn't in the answer ChatGPT gave you, then you can look further. And Buddhism is quite interesting. I think the Buddha it's my belief that the Buddha taught everything that needed to be taught for his students. So there was never a situation where a student came up with a problem and the Buddha didn't have a solution for that problem. So, these are problems not around like everyday life, but around seeing things in the mind. He'd give analogies, he'd give techniques, he'd give practices of watching your body or contemplating things, etc. He had a whole map. He had a roadmap for everything in your mind. But the thing he could not do is know what is actually happening in your mind. Although some stories say that he could read your mind. And ultimately, that meant that the Buddha, you need to ultimately be able to notice what's going on. And then notice, hey, when I apply this, does it get the result that I expected? If not, how do I apply this slightly differently? Maybe I'm not applying this quite right. Maybe I try this, maybe I try that. So my teacher in Buddhism has said, like, it's not a ironclad technique where like you just follow step 1, step 2, step 3, and then you say, "Hey, I did it. Teacher, can you check this?" And the teacher checks it and says, "Okay, you got it." You go to the next level of enlightenment. Not at all. You have to actually check it for yourself and see, do I get the benefits? And if not, you have to make adjustments to see if it applies to your life. In everyday life, meaning decisions you make in the world, who should I be friends with? Who should I marry? Should I get romantically involved now with this person? Should I wait? Or what job should I have? Should I apply to this university? Should I study this? What career should I have? Those kinds of questions. You can also do the same thing. ChatGPT and AI will give you a lot of options, but how to apply it in your specific situation is really up to you. And I read as a little footnote, it's really tempting to follow ChatGPT or the advice before ChatGPT of experts or advice columns. It might be okay to blindly follow ChatGPT 90% of the time, or like life pro tips or other things like that. But knowing 10% of the time you cannot is sometimes very important. Because sometimes there are situations where any reasonable answer is correct, but sometimes if you get the wrong answer, it can lead you in a very bad path. And that's where you really need to develop these thinking skills. What am I thinking? What's happening? What's going on? What am I noticing? What is the evidence if you're looking at something outside in the world, or what is happening in my own body? And what are the stories associated with it if you're looking at a thought pattern? You need to really look at that. That makes a lot of the difference. That makes a lot of difference. With all that said, I'm going to shoot myself in the foot, meaning I'm going to contradict myself. There are plenty of people, 90% of people who think very little or nothing about thinking skills. They just think about power or family, relationships, success, praise, avoiding pain, eating good food, any of those things. They don't really think about thinking skills. That's, the Buddha would say, at your own peril. You can live a very good life that way if you get lucky. But eventually, in everyone's life, there will be difficulties. And the Buddha said, and several non-Buddhist people, wise non-Buddhist people, sorry, not non-wise, wise non-Buddhists have said, you really want to look at your own contribution to this, your own mind, and how that mind is causing this misery to yourself or others. And that's, I think, the difference in this AI age. It's very interesting. Knowledge, answers, even very reasonable answers, they're all there. And there's almost not a question you can ask that ChatGPT and Gemini can't give you a pretty good answer about. Because it's read like the blogs and journals of millions of people. Millions of articles online, millions of books. But it still it cannot look inside you and say, does this work for you? What should you do in this situation? What is going on inside yourself? So similarly, in ChatGPT or AI, you can just type in, how do I get rid of fear? And there are ways, and it will probably give you some code. Actually, why don't I just do that as a final thing? How do I get rid of fear? Let's see what it said. So overcoming fear is a common challenge, but it's possible with the right strategies. Here are some effective techniques. I'll let it translate so that you can have it after this. Gradual exposure, understand your fear, cognitive behavioral therapy, relaxation, mindfulness and acceptance, seek support, challenge your beliefs. Yeah, if you do all these things, I think it's quite good. But be kind to yourself, celebrate your progress, no matter how small. And here's the tie. I think this is it's the right question and the wrong question. How do I deal with fear? And anyone who's dealt with fear, let me put it this way: everyone who has fear wants to get rid of it. And if there's a switch you can find to like make the fear go away, hey, use that switch. If you find that switch when you're unhappy, you can turn it on and off. When you're afraid, you can turn it off. When you're unhappy, you can turn it off. When you're unhappy, you can turn on the switch for being happy. Use that. In fact, if you can find a way to solve all your problems in life and also deal with any misfortune and turn it around in your life, use that. If you can only get what you want and avoid all discomfort, use that. But the insight of Buddhism says that you can't ever escape those things. So a lot of this just has to do with understanding your mind. And some of these are very good. But depending on what your goal is, right? You're going to have different things. And it's not as straightforward as a list. Lists are very helpful. They're checklists, double check these things. Very, very helpful, but it's not something you want to rely on too much. Because eventually you need to, I think it goes back to this phrase, what I wrote. If you find just one thing where you can say, now I see a choice or pattern of thinking. I couldn't see this before. This is important to me because blank. If you can see that, then you have a chance of seeing other things you couldn't see before. And those things you couldn't see are probably the things that are going to hurt you the most. And I think, or limit you the most if you're more into achieving, making money, being happy. So I think that's what I want to say about ChatGPT and AI and thinking skills. And I'm going to stop this video now. Good luck.